And our next speaker I welcome to the virtual podium here is SherAli Tareen. SherAli is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. He received his PhD in Religious Studies from Duke University, but we like him anyway. His research focuses on Muslim intellectual traditions and debates in early Muslim and modern South Asia. His first book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, which came out in 2020, received a number of commendations and awards. It received the American Institute of Pakistan Studies Book Prize and was selected as a finalist for the American Academy of Religion Book Award in 2021. It's a really monumental book. A great deal of effort went into it, and there are many, many insights packed in there. So SherAli, thank you for that, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you so much, Rohit, for organizing this conference and for including me in it. Although it's still only February, but you already have the Best Conference Organizer of the Year award. Thank you so much. I've prepared some comments to stay within my 12 minutes. And this presentation comes from a brief extract of one chapter of my current book project, which looks at intra-Muslim scholarly debates and discourses on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century. On the early morning of March 17th, 1876, Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi died 1877, one of the founders of the prestigious South Asian Islamic seminary, the Deoband Madrasa, established in 1866, boarded a train from his native village of Nanota in Uttar Pradesh, northern India. Traveling via Delhi for a journey of roughly 400 miles, his eventual destination was the small village of Chandapur in the northern Indian district of Shahjahanpur. The objective of Nanotwi's visit to Chandapur was to participate in an interreligious polemical festival known as the Festival of Deciding the True God, Mela-e-Khuda Shinasi. Accompanied by a retinue of around 20 disciples and associates, some professional debaters and others driven by the anticipation of entertainment, Nanotwi had been invited to this festival by the local Muslims of Shahjahanpur, who had desired a prominent Muslim scholar to defend Islam at the event. This festival was held for 2 consecutive years in 1875 and 1876 in the same location. In my 12 minutes, by describing certain key fragments of the Shahjahanpur polemic, as narrated from the perspective of Deobandi historiography, I wish to highlight some of the novel conceptions of religion, history, and the public that it brought into view. More specifically, I'm interested in the question of how, following the loss of Muslim political sovereignty in South Asia, distinct visions of sovereign power are attached to the body and figure of Prophet Muhammad, especially in such moments of interreligious contest and encounter. The polemical festival of Shahjahanpur brought together leading Christian missionaries and Hindu and Muslim scholars in India, charged with the task of debating and defending the authenticity of their respective religions. Qasim Nanotwi, who led the contingent of Muslim scholars at this event, is a towering figure in the intellectual history of Islam in South Asia. Though he died at a relatively young age of 44, he wrote prolifically on a broad range of subjects, including law, theology, philosophy, and Sufism, and was one of the founders of arguably the most influential Muslim reform movement and seminary in modern South Asia, the Deoband Madrasa. Apart from Qasim Nanotwi, the most prominent religious figure who attended this festival was the arch polemicist and founder of the Hindu reformist group, the Arya Samaj, Dayananda Saraswati, died 1883. Saraswati had very recently, only a year ago, published his scandalous polemic against different religious traditions, Satyat Prakash, the Light of Truth. In a chapter devoted exclusively to Islam, Dayananda had scathingly mocked the Quran and Prophet Muhammad, causing the fury among Muslim scholars. The leading protagonist representing Christianity at this event was someone called Father Knowles, a British missionary in Shahjahanpur from the Methodist Episcopal Mission, who had served as the headmaster of a local missionary school for 4 years. He had rapidly grown in prominence thanks to his remarkably effective proselytizing campaigns in the region. A charismatic and aggressive debater, Knowles had participated in a series of such polemics, though none of this scale. The polemic of Shahjahanpur was organized through the patronage of the British magistrate of the district, Robert George Gray. In addition to Gray, the primary sponsor of the event, who also handled all the logistical arrangements, was a certain Munshi Pyare Lal, a wealthy Hindu landowner of Shahjahanpur. It was Pyare Lal who had originally devised the idea of a public showdown between religious communities and scholars from competing traditions, and then supervised its execution. Thus, one can think of the Shahjahanpur polemic as a shared venture between the machineries of the colonial state and the indigenous landed elite. Now, why would the colonial state be interested in patronizing such spectacles of interreligious encounter? While the question of motives is never conclusively apparent, what is clearly at work here is the expression of a modern colonial logic of secularism, whereby the domain of religious passions and contest is protected and even celebrated, and yet also quarantined from the spheres of politics and governance. The physical and discursive site of the Shahjahanpur polemic reinforced the dual colonial promise of advancing the mission of civilizing the native through missionary activity and separating the field of indigenous religious quarrels and debate from that of politics and state governance. Preparations for this event had been underway for many months in advance. It was heavily advertised in local newspapers and in other public venues, such as local schools, shops, and through the distribution of pamphlets. In addition to the polemic participants, hundreds of people from neighboring towns and villages, especially Deoband, Meerut, Delhi, Moradabad, Rampur, Sambhal, and Bareilly, attended the event and served as spectators to this mega polemical showdown. The actual event was held under large tents that had been put up on a tract of barren land in Chandapur. Each contingent representing Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism were camped in their own respective tents, retiring to their lodges after each day's proceedings. The British Magistrate's Office provided more than 200 chairs, food, and other necessary items for the event. They also arranged for the local police to monitor the venue and to prevent the eruption of communal violence. The festival lasted 4 days each year. As one might expect, the historiography of each group claims its own victory. The polemic itself focused on a range of theological and philosophical problems, including monotheism, divine will, human agency, the problem of evil, rebirth and transmigration, miracles, the authenticity of scriptures, and so on, as each side strived to establish the exclusive authenticity of its doctrinal system. For the remainder of my time, I turn my focus to a specific discursive moment that was among the most heated and illuminating moments of disagreement during this polemical festival: the question of prophetic miracles, or the question of whose miracles are most miraculous. In Satyat Prakash, Dayananda Saraswati, while impugning Prophet Muhammad and trying to frame him as an impostor, had especially attacked the credibility of miracles attached to Muhammad and of miracles found in the Quran more broadly. In responding to Saraswati's provocations, Qasim Nanotwi did two things. One, he tried to establish the superiority and incredibility of Prophet Muhammad's miracles over those of pre-Islamic prophets who figure prominently in Judaism and Christianity. The most famous of Muhammad's miracles in this regard was, of course, the incident of the splitting of the moon in half, through which the Prophet answered and silenced the recalcitrant unbelievers of Mecca who had demanded a miracle from him. By splitting the moon in half, Muhammad had transformed and uncoupled the original form of the moon. Thus, for Nanotwi, this was a miracle much more incredible and scientifically improbable than, and hence superior to, other prophetic miracles dealing with natural phenomena, such as, say, Prophet Joshua's famous miracle of having made the sun stay stationary for a long time. According to Nanotwi, there was nothing particularly incredible about that, since every journey or movement eventually culminates in rest. Therefore, by keeping the sun stationary for a long time, Joshua had simply confirmed the natural laws of movement, as opposed to Prophet Muhammad's miracle of splitting the moon in half that had dramatically interrupted rather than reinforced the laws of nature. Now, having established the superiority of Muhammad's miracles over the miracles of Jewish and Christian prophets, the rather fascinating details of which are in the longer written version of this chapter, Nanotwi offered a curious explanation for why he had omitted any mention of Hindu miracles in his discussion. The logic of his explanation is of considerable interest to me because it is quite revealing of the way he imagined the interaction of history, sovereignty, and religious authenticity. According to Nanotwi, the main reason for the omission of Hindu miracles from his exposition was the poor standards of historical writing that marked the Hindu tradition. As he put it, no historian would consider histories of the Hindus as reliable, end of quote. For instance, Nanotwi explained, the splitting of the moon was also mentioned in the Mahabharata as an event that took place during the reign of the celebrated Hindu sage Vishwamitra. However, Nanotwi bemoaned, one finds no reliable chain of transmission, sanad, connecting the author of the Mahabharata with the narrator from the era of Vishwamitra. He proceeded to speculate that, in all probability, the Hindus have stolen the moon splitting incident from Muslim historiography. According to Nanotwi, this kind of historical ineptitude stood in stark contrast with the Muslim tradition that was universally recognized for its historicist prowess. As Nanotwi triumphantly put it, and I quote him here, no religion can rival Islam in the department of establishing the soundness of religious discourses and oral traditions. Especially the narrative of the Prophet's splitting of the moon is beyond any doubt. This event was documented in prophetic reports that were massively transmitted with uninterrupted chains of transmission. Now, but if the Muslim standards of historical empiricism were indeed so unrivaled, then why was this event, the Prophet's splitting of the moon, not recorded in world histories? This was precisely a question that Dayananda Saraswati had raised in his attempt to undermine the authenticity of this story. Saraswati had argued that the absence of the splitting of the moon narrative in world histories clearly showed that Muslims had fabricated the story and attached it to Prophet Muhammad. But Nanotwi was not to be so easily outshone in the department of empiricist chauvinism. Nanotwi responded to Dayananda's charge of fabrication by first reminding his arch rival that even Hindu miracles were not found in any histories of the world. As he sarcastically asked, in which history of the world was the Mahabharata's narrative of the splitting of the moon in Vishwamitra's reign recorded? Nanotwi proceeded by explaining the absence of the moon splitting incident in world histories through arguments that combined desire for scientific certitude with purposeful penchant for theatrical apologetics. He said, at that time, meaning the time when the moon split in half, it must have been approaching midnight in India, and dawn had not struck yet in Western countries. Add to this the fact that it was the middle of the winter. People in India were buried under their blankets. They were intoxicated in their dreams, unaware of even their own existence. In this condition, it was impossible for them to take notice of an event like the splitting of the moon that took place for only a few fleeting seconds. And even if someone were awake at that time, why on earth would he be staring at the sky in anticipation of the moon to split? Moreover, the pollution and the dust in the air must have also made it very difficult to see the sky clearly. Now, coming to my conclusion. Notice the intimacy of historicism and religious authenticity in Nanotwi's thought. History and inclusion in a domain of knowledge called world histories represented the discursive battleground on which the authenticity of a religious tradition was to be contested and determined. The authenticity of a religion depended on its capacity to be empirically historicized. Hinduism thus was not even part of history proper. At the same time, in memory of the Prophet nestled in the sovereign fortress of historicist vigor, compensated for the sovereign lack of a moment marked by the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. The main point on which I want to end is this. Certainly, at the polemic of Shahjahanpur, Nanotwi was participating in a long-running tradition of interreligious polemical contestation in Islam known as the Munazara tradition, predating the colonial period by many centuries. However, the conceptual and institutional terrain in which he was obliged to operate during the Shahjahanpur polemic was resoundingly new, defined by the emergence of a new public sphere in which the state at once managed and patronized religious debates, the spectatorship of a public readily available to be reformed, preached, and doctrinally persuaded, the availability of a new conceptual object called religion that was known through its propositional doctrines and evaluated through its historicist rigor, and the emergence of a new kind of subject in public whose job it was to decide on the truth and untruth of competing religious claims. Thus, at the festival of deciding the true God, even as Nanotwi served as a defender of tradition, he was also what the anthropologist David Scott so memorably called a conscript of modernity. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, SherAli.